Welcome to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and their journey. Now, let's get started with the show.
Dr. Jeremy Weiss here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Bruce Eckfeldt, and you can check him out at eckfeldt.com. I'm going to spell it for you because it's not so intuitive, but it's ECKFELDT.com. Bruce, I'm going to formally introduce you in a second, but I always like to point out other episodes of the podcast people should check out. Some of my top favorites, actually you've been very active in the EO universe, right? And so Robert Hartline was a great one. He had a chain of, you may know some of these people, actually a chain of cell phone stores that he built up. And he then also has a software called Proof. I had Matt Zalk on, who does property management all across Arkansas, Oklahoma, and the surrounding areas there. I had Vern Harnish, who started EO actually and wrote Scaling Up. And I know Bruce is a big fan of Scaling Up and uses the methodologies there. You could check those out and more on InspiredInsider.com. This episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect their dream relationships and partnerships. We do it in two ways. One, we're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, accountability, the full execution and production. Number two, we're also an easy button for a company's gifting. So we make gifting and staying top of mind to clients, partners, prospects, and even staff from a culture perspective. All you do is give us the list of people. We'll do everything else, curate the gifts and the box and make sure your logos on everything, et cetera. Bruce, we call ourselves kind of the magic elves that run in the background to make it stress-free for companies to build amazing relationships. And I've found no better way over the past decade to profile people I admire and share, what they're working on my podcast and send them sweet treats in the mail. So check it out at rise25.com or email us at support@rise25.com. I am super excited to introduce Bruce Eckfeldt. He's a former architect turned successful tech CEO who now coaches founders of high growth companies. Previously, he actually scaled a business onto the Inc. 500 list, 5,000 list, multiple times. Actually, you were on my business partner, John Corcoran's podcast, and you actually had a lengthy discussion about that. It's not easy to do because you need to grow multiple times. And he had a successful exit. And he uses his experience in scaling up, 3HAG, lean agile methodologies to help leaders scale faster and exit bigger with less drama. And big thank you to Jerry Nylands for actually John Corcoran didn't even connect us. Jerry Nylands did of Trades Press Services. So Bruce, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeremy. I appreciate it.
I'm going to pull up your site in a second, but just tell people what you do.
Yeah. So, today, and that's changed over the years and over time. My primary job is really focusing on founders, working with them on scaling strategies. How do you go from a couple million to a couple $100 million in revenue, and then ultimately, what does your exit look like? Whether it's financial, strategic, or ESOPs, or figuring out that next chapter. One of the things I've certainly learned in my own exit experience, and then, having worked with many founders on this process, is you really kind of need to figure out what's next. And once you kind of figure out what's next, it gives you a lot of insight in terms of then what kind of exit you're going to have. And then we can kind of define what kind of company you're going to scale. So I end up kind of reverse engineering a lot of this, is really kind of having the discussion of what they want to do ultimately. And then how do we create the company that is going to get them there?
We'll talk about your exit and previous company in a second, but I know when you're listening to this, the book may be out, it may not be out, or maybe it's coming out soon, because it is coming out soon in our conversation, but you have a different take on exits. And so I don't know if you have a title or working title that we can talk about. So we point it, if not, we're looking at your website here. You can go to their website.
Yeah, it will be on the website.
And I'm sure it'll be on there, but talk about your different take on exits.
Yeah. So the working title is called Springboard. And it really is kind of this idea of, rather than thinking about your exit as an ending, think about your exit as a springboard into the next thing. And so, and really comes from honest in my own experience through my kind of exit, and like I said, many of the exits that I've worked on and founders that I've talked to that have gone through exits. And the fact is I exited at. That's a good question. When did I exit? 40, 39, 38 even maybe. I can't remember. I'd have to do the math again to figure out the dates. But, these are not, and my, my exit was very, very nice, but it wasn't like I'm not going to work again in the rest of my life kind of thing, right? Like it was an opportunity to cash out. It was an opportunity to kind of change a chapter. And honestly, I think most of the exits are like that. Right. Yes, I've talked to a few people that have had, $100 million exits, and even there, although they're totally financially secure, they don't need to make another dollar, the rest of their lives. They need to do something, right? The whole idea that you're going to sit on a beach and drink pina coladas is, this idea that works for 2 weeks if you're lucky. And so you really need to have some kind of idea, whether it's because you need to make money or you just want to have, a passion, or you want to have an impact in the world. And so what I've really kind of looked at is the world of exit literature mostly is around transactions, mostly about valuation, mostly about the deal, very little about the what is next and how does that deal set you up for that strategically. So I end up doing a lot of work with not only thinking about what is the exit that you need, but what are the assets, what's the reputation, what's the network that you need, pre-exit, so that once you have your exit, you're all set up and queued up and ready for the next thing, and not sitting there flat-footed, wondering what to do next, and running into existential crisis, which is not uncommon in those situations.
What do you wish you would have known? I'm assuming this is one of those things, because oftentimes we write books for ourselves 10 years, 10 years ago.
Yeah, so I think that the two things that I wish would have played out differently, I wish I would have done differently. One is kind of understanding why I was even in the company. Right. Because I think, a lot of entrepreneurs end up in these companies kind of by happenstance. Right. It's a little bit of, I turned left and then this thing happened. And the next thing I knew, I had a business. Right. And so, you kind of lose this sense of purpose, I think, when you just start focusing on the company and why you I was an architect originally. I was not trained as a business person. I did not. When my mother asked me what I wanted to do when I was young, I said I wanted to be an artist and marry a rich woman. Right, that was my strategy. Right, so I didn't have
as a young age. Wow.
Yeah, and I was
the rich woman
artist.
Actually surprises me. The artist doesn't surprise me.
Well, so I was passionate, but I was practical. Like I knew that as an artist, I wouldn't make any money. I needed a strategy there. But so I didn't. It wasn't like I had these ambitions or this lifelong yearning to found a company and be a CEO and have this exit. And so as I got into it, like I think it would have been much easier for me in kind of figuring out what path I wanted to do, and not only how I wanted to exit and what I wanted to do next, but really how I wanted to operate the company. Right. And I think a lot of what I ended up in the situation was I had this, really nice company and we had some really great stuff, but not that I wasn't happy. It just wasn't aligned with really my core purpose and, what I was good at and what I really love to do. So I think that was number one. Number two is, I think I certainly felt very stuck at the end of the business in that I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of options. And so when the exit opportunity came up, it was kind of fortuitous and it was kind of a nice deal that landed in the lap. And I was like, I'm just going to take it because I don't know what else is going to happen next. And I think if I would A, understand my purpose better, B, had a little bit more of a plan and had some different options that were really more aligned with what I wanted to do, have a bit of a plan of what I would do next, and then kind of choose an option that would set me up that way. I left my earnout early, right? Like I had a 3-year earnout. I lasted 9 months, 10 months, maybe.
Why is that?
Well, it's just like once you kind of give up the reins, right? So when it's your company, it's your baby and you're running, you sell it and now it's someone else's company and it's just a job. And I realized that, I was getting paid well, but it was like, I don't want this job, right? This is no longer fun. And, I think this happens pretty typically, right? You take these earnouts because you get a better deal, right? You get better valuation, right? They say, oh, great. Yeah, you want this much. Fine. Like we're going to put it in an earnout. And you're thinking, oh, well, great. Now you forget that you've got to earn that money, right? And that's work that you still have to do. And showing up to work every day when you own the company is one thing. Showing up to work every day when you're someone else's company at that point, that whole psychology changes. And I think that is vastly underappreciated, mostly for, entrepreneurs, and what that really changes in terms of psychology and motivation. And then, of course, it's someone else's company, right? They're going to have decisions. They're going to have control on certain things. And, yeah, you can have the best conversations in the world pre-deal about, oh, what the plans are. We're going to grow it. We're going to do this. Like, we're going to keep the people. We're going to keep the, culture, right? All these things. At the end of the day, like post-transaction, all bets are off, right? Like it's going to be different. And it's not even malicious. I think it's just situational, right? Things change, dynamics change, markets change. You got to make harder decisions. They're going to make decisions differently than you are. And so, I think that whole taking the exit, the terms of the deal end up becoming much more important, or much more important than people think, than just the pure number. And it's hard, you get caught up in the number, you get caught up in the reputation, you're talking to your friends and all like, what do you sell for? What was your valuation? What was the number? How much you make, right? Like you get caught up in that psychology and you forget about what does that actually mean to be, right? I've had funny cases too, where people, agree to non-competes for periods of time. And, I had one client I worked with there, he ended up getting in trouble for mentoring, because the buying company said, well, no, these, work mentoring other companies, even if it wasn't directly competitive, was still violating or potentially violating non-compete. And look, we probably could have gone to court, probably would not get ruled against us, but just dealing with it was a nightmare, right? So it's just, we could take up time, money of actually fighting it. And so you just had to say, fine, had to step back and spent 3 years quiet, hiding, until that non-compete was up. So these are the things that I just find people don't think about, and ends up having a huge amount of impact in terms of really their future happiness, but really the effectiveness of the deal.
I want to talk about general advice in mistakes. Okay. You mentioned a couple, right? Maybe being careful of non-compete. I've heard you in other videos talk about being okay with what you get right off the bat, which you kind of mentioned your earnout. What are some other general, again, we're talking general rules here. Every situation may not apply, but from your experience with yourself and many other people, what are some general rules people should consider with the exit, and maybe some mistakes too?
Yeah. Kind of where to start. I think more conceptual ones and then more practical ones. I think conceptual ones is really be aware of, as best you can, and it's really hard to do this, and that's why you kind of hire other people and get other people involved in the process, is your kind of identity attachment to the business. And you don't realize it till you lose it, but how much you have your own kind of self-worth, your ego, your sense of identity is wrapped up in the business and being the founder and being the CEO of a business. And one of the key things that I end up doing is making sure that we've got a broad social relational network for founders outside of the company. Because I always like, it happens every time. They sell the company and it's like, no one returns their phone calls, right? And all these people that were my friends were really just my colleagues in business. And now, they're either off to other things or they're still in the business. I'm no longer in it. And I've lost all of these social connections because my social world has been entangled with my professional world, particularly my company. And so I think one is making sure you've developed a robust and well-diversified identity outside of the business. And that's something I would say do sooner rather than later. I think it's something that you can kind of go, it's good to kind of keep in mind going into business and early stage companies like, okay, how balanced am I? And, we can talk about family and other things too, but people get very focused on the business. So I think that's one area that I end up doing a lot of work in, or ends up becoming quite a bit of an issue.
Do people push back on that? Like with you, Bruce, like, that's not going to be a problem for me. I have a lot of friends who, I have various relationships with, or is that, are they like, oh yeah, I get that?
So some of this is probably a filter. Like I end up probably working with people that kind of get that. If you really don't get that, you're probably not going to hire me. or I'm probably not going to want to work with you. So now I think they're aware of it. They probably realize they're not aware as they probably need to be, and they probably realize that it's still going to be a challenge, right? Like it's something that you need to put some positive pressure behind to make happen. Even if you're aware of it, like you have to do something about it, and that takes time and energy and decisions, and you have to make some offsets and stuff. So, and it's you always think it's not as bad as it's going to be. It ends up being a lot worse than it is, right? Like I think that's every facet of this is, I think every entrepreneur, every founder goes into this. Oh yeah, I've thought about that. Don't worry, I'm totally prepared for it. And they get to the other side and they're like, oh my God, I was not prepared for this, right? Every interview that I've done on the podcast, not 90% of them. I think that's a big kind of general one. I think the next kind of category, so there's a lot of this kind of personal, emotional kind of connection stuff, which is a bucket. The other bucket is I talk about making your business buyable. So there's valuation, which we can start talking about valuation drivers and things that a buyer is going to look at in terms of like moving that number up or down in terms of what the valuation is or what they're willing to pay for the business. But separately from that, I talk about buyability, meaning you can actually have really good fundamentals and a highly profitable business that has a lot of future growth that, should be valued in a certain way at a certain number. But if the business doesn't have the information organized, doesn't have the structures in place, hasn't documented everything, right? It is not set up to be buyable. It's like it's putting a veil in front of the business. And so the buyer, even if beyond the veil, it's this great business, but they can't see through the veil, if that veil is really thick and cloudy, they're going to have to devalue. They're going to have to offset value for that risk, right? Uncertainty, lack of clarity equates to risk for a buyer. And so if I haven't done those things, if I've created a lot of fog around my business and they can't see it, even if it's there, if they can't see it, they're not going to value it, or they're going to offset it with risk. Making it buyable is really important. And that's, like I said, having documents together, having all of your, contracts, having all those things in place and your data repository, data vaults, right? Having all that stuff together. And if you can show up to the beginning of a transaction or beginning of a conversation with the potential buyer with having all that stuff clearly laid out, that buyer is going to be much more likely, A is going to probably give you a much better valuation because they actually see the data, and the transaction is going to go much more smoothly, which is probably the biggest risk in most of the deals that I see. Is like the more time that goes on, the more delays, the more hiccups, right? The less likely a deal is going to happen, and the more likely you're going to get, you're going to have risk on the business. You're going to have a downturn. You're going to lose a client. They're going to come back and say, well, I know we wanted to offer you 32 million, but now we're thinking 26, right? Like you're going to lose money. So having that stuff together. The other thing I tend to do, and this is a little bit of a deal strategy thing, a lot of founders, a lot of sellers will, you certainly want to put your best foot forward, but they try to oversell the business. And what happens is that it's only, later in the conversation or in due diligence where, some of the things start coming up. It's like, oh, well, we didn't realize your client concentration was quite this big, or, okay, yeah, we look like, we're missing some of these documents, or we didn't see that, 3 years ago we had this lawsuit that, was resolved, but right, maybe there's some liabilities around it or something, or, there's going to be things. Every business has skeletons. I've written articles on this. My suggestion, my strategy on this stuff is put all the skeletons in the closet up front. Like literally, I like creating a list of all the reasons you shouldn't buy my company. Right? Put them all on the table up front. And that's going to do two things. One, it's going to make it a much more real conversation, right? The buyer is going to be much more aware of the things that they're buying, but more importantly, it's going to build trust, right? Because ultimately that is what drives these transactions. If the buyer trusts that the seller is representing themselves and the business appropriately, they're going to follow through on the deals. If the buyer starts to feel like, okay, when's the next shoe going to drop? When's the next, skeleton going to come out of this closet? That's where they start getting skittish, and either they, they'll kill deals, or they'll just keep bringing down valuations to offset that risk. And so some of the best transactions that I've seen that I've been involved in had that almost like unselling the buyer in the beginning, and then the buyer's just sucking up. They're like, okay, great. right? Like, okay, I can solve all these things. And once they realize there's no other things they need to worry about, they'll push forward with the deal. They'll give you the value. They'll be very clear with things, right? So it's a little bit of reverse psychology, or a little bit of maybe a psychology most buyers aren't used to, or most sellers aren't used to. But I think that's a real game changer in terms of the dynamics of the sale process.
I love that because I feel like it's counterintuitive advice, right?
Mm-hmm.
A little bit. At least I'll phrase it like that.
Yeah.
So counterintuitive advice we'll say is like, just share out all the skeletons up front. Because even if you think of like a dating relationship, it's a bit counterintuitive. Like
it's not a bad analogy though.
Right.
Like,
yeah. But you may scare someone off, obviously, but maybe they should be scared off, right? So,
if you're going to marry them, right? If you're going to do the deal, they're going to find out at some point. That's always my thing, is they're going to find out sometime.
Yeah. At what point do you share? Right. So sharing skeletons up front.
Yeah.
I think also just thinking of your broader relationships beyond the exit. What other things, maybe at this point you don't even consider them counterintuitive, but maybe best practices that most people don't think are best practices in the exit process?
So the one that comes to mind is I always try to keep this philosophy, or keep in mind that the seller is the other buyer. So like even if you're in an unsolicited offer, meaning there's no other offers on the table, right? And ideally we want to be in a situation where we've got, 3 or 4 offers, right? We can competitively bid this. It's a little bit of an auction, right? Like if one isn't working out, you can go to the second one, right? You've got some choices. What's hard in these unsolicited or single buyer situations, it's, people feel like, okay, well, I kind of have to take it, or I kind of like, there's no other option here. And the philosophy I like to put in place is like, you are always the other buyer, right? So you can buy your business from yourself, right? And I like to think about like, okay, what terms would you buy your business for? And if the other buyer, if the unsolicited offer is better than the terms that you would buy your business for, take the unsolicited offer. But if not, buy the business, basically keep it. Right. And the challenge is a lot of founders aren't prepared to do that. Right. They're selling the business because they just want out, or they're exhausted, or like, and so what I always say is let's deal with those things first before we try to do a transaction, because we need to keep this in a situation where you'd be willing to buy your business if the other offer is not good enough. And so it both changes all the prep work, right? It really kind of digs into motivation. Why are we selling? Like, what are the things we can do to offset this, right? Like, how do we not get in a situation where we're in a forced sale? But it also then allows them to go into this negotiations with confidence. It's like, okay, buyer, right? Like, what are these terms? I don't like that earnout, right? I'm going to take my earnout, which is I'm going to keep the business. Right. So it gives them kind of a psychology of, I do have an option, right? Like I am not negotiating against, nothing, right? Like I'm negotiating against keeping it.
Bruce, what would you say, or maybe we'll call it the be careful stuff? You mentioned the non-compete. Also mentioned earnout. Are there other things that from your experience people should be careful about?
So the things that typically come up, things that I do a lot of post-transaction coaching work too. It's like a earnout coaching where people have sold and they're kind of figuring, okay, I got the rest of my money.
That's a good niche. I like that. Earnout.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And it kind of depends on if they still have equity and if they're, managing the business or not managing the business. It gets a little complicated, but it's an interesting situation. The nice thing is that there's typically, the scoreboard's set, right? There's typically terms around, okay, I can make another $10 million if I can get, operating margin to here, if I can get growth to here, if I can get, profits here, right? So I love those things in the sense that, what winning is very defined, and we can hyper focus the work that we're doing to hit those numbers. Now, sometimes the challenge is they don't have they've lost a lot of the decision making and the kind of resources and control element. So we're sometimes having to be a little more scrappy, or we're dealing with limited options in cases. But I think the things that often become problematic. So one is, and let's separate these out a little more formally. So there's deferred payment, which is, they say, okay, we're going to value your company at 20 million. We're going to give you 10. We're going to give 10 you cash on signing, which would be nice. We're going to do 5 as a note payment and 5 as an earnout. So 5 and the note payment it's a guaranteed payment, meaning you don't have to do anything to get that money. And it's usually structured, like a 5-year note or quarterly payments or something like that. But the challenge there is typically those things are backed, are collateralized by the company. So, as much as you're like, oh, well, it's a note, it's like, all right, well, if the company goes south and the buyers decide to, there's all sorts of things buyers can do. Once you own the company, you move the assets to another place, you start deferring revenues, right? Like they can basically shell the company, and great, they default on the note. And as remedy, you get the company back, but now the company is not worth anything anyway. So I'm always looking at those guaranteed payments. While it looks like a fixed note payment, there's still a significant amount of risk on it, particularly if it's only backed by the assets of the company. Now they can sometimes back it with other assets they have, right? But depending on the company, how sophisticated they are, most times is they're going to run you out of money in court trying to collect on that stuff, then you actually can claw back. So those are the deferred payments. Earnouts are more specifically around if the company performs in certain ways, that you will get additional money. Now, there's 2 versions of this. One is where you're actively involved in the company, like you're in the company in some kind of management, or maybe even stay on as leader, a CEO, and you have some control or some influence potentially over hitting those numbers or not. And usually I would say you probably don't have as much control, certainly as you would like, oftentimes as you think. But so that money is at risk that way. And if you don't have a management control, then, you're basically an earnout, but it's like, okay, let's see how you do, right? Like you only make money if they hit the numbers. So, there's a lot of risk in those things. The other one that comes up is executive compensation and executive bonus. So if you're going to stay on as CEO, like what are you getting paid for that job? And is it market rate? Is it above market rate? And then is there performance bonuses based on that that kind of go into it? So, in the end, these get a little complicated because it's, well, what am I getting paid at signing? What deferred payments am I getting on a note? What earnouts am I getting, based on company performance, whether or not I'm involved in the company? And then I potentially have an executive compensation package with potential performance bonuses on that. All those things can, figuring out the net present value of all those things and the risk around all those things are difficult. And oftentimes what I find is if you look at like 3 years or 5 years out, depending on these earnouts, where you would be financially at the end of that, say, 5-year period with the deal, getting the cash, getting the payments, getting the earnouts, getting the executive comp, versus if you just kept the company. Sometimes it's not as good. Sometimes just keeping the company is better, right? Because the big challenge is continuing to build equity, right? Like once you sell a company, yes, you may have a 20% stake in it, but your rate in which you're building equity on the 20% stake is much less than when you own the company. And you are probably pulling, if, a successful company, like you're probably pulling, at least a couple $100,000, maybe $1 million in income out of the company as well. So now, you're looking at 5 years, that would be another $5 million in personal income plus the increase in equity. Like doing this math can get a little complicated, but when you do it, like some of these deals may look good on paper in some respects, but consider the option of keeping it sometimes is not as good.
Bruce, talk about what are some examples, because I know with the book and you really focus on what's next before, and we were talking before we hit record, one of the people, they may not sell for 5 years and they're thinking 5 years from now what they're doing next to prepare. What are some examples of what you hear or when you explore what to do next? What are people saying?
Yeah. So I'll kind of bucket it into kind of business venture and then non-business venture. The business venture stuff, what becomes interesting is where there's some kind of derivative business opportunity based on the company they're in now that they can start a new company around. So, if they're a product company, they see an opportunity to do some ancillary services or something, or there's an adjacent industry we can take the product to. And so those become interesting because we're actually looking for either developing outside assets. So it could be relationships, it could be IP and things like that. We may say, okay, look, let's let's take this other application, put it into a separate entity, and you can nurture that pre-exit and get that cleaved off and owned and outside of the current company, so that when you sell that thing, you're not selling this asset that you can take somewhere else. In some cases, we're identifying those assets inside of the company, and part of the deal that you're putting on the table with the buyer is like, hey, either I want a license to be able to use this in a non-competitive way, or I'm cleaving this off. I'm not selling this thing. So I worked with a packaging company for a while, and they worked in a very particular industry, but there was some underlying IP associated with some of these packaging technologies that could be applied to many other industries. So a lot of what we were doing in terms of setting up these potential deals was selling the use of these package technologies in this particular industry, but keeping the rights to be able to go to other industries. Because this person, she wanted to go off and she had lots of ideas of where else she wanted to take this thing. She wanted to get out of this industry. She ran that race. And so, so we were looking at how do we kind of cleave those things off. So it could be, assets, capabilities. It could be data, right? It could be, just knowledge. It could be building up a knowledge base. It could be building up a network, right? So how do I use the platform I have as CEO, founder, and CEO of a company for the next 3 years to build up a network, a reputation, getting involved in boards, industry organizations, right? Like we can find some really practical things we can do to create assets and values and capabilities that will survive or will be retained post-exit that can be leveraged into the next thing. And then obviously we want to look at the deal terms themselves, and we may be willing to take a valuation that's 20% lower if we don't have an earnout, or if we have a 1-year earnout, right? Or if we only have a 1-year non-compete rather than the 3-year non-compete, because we know that, it's worth it, right? Like we may give up $5 million on a valuation, but if we know that we can jumpstart a new business that could be worth another 10, 20, $30 million in a couple of years, fine, right? Particularly if it gives the founder something to do, right? Like, sometimes it's just a matter of, I want to plan, like I want to work. I don't want to actually sit on the beach for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And sometimes their spouses don't want them sitting on the beach for a year, 3 years. I had one story of this founder who was planning an exit, and he had a whole thing. He actually put a deposit on a boat, a sailing trip, because he was like, oh yeah, I want to sail. I want to sail for 6 months across, to Europe and everything. His wife looks at him and says, I don't know who you're going to sail with. You're not sailing with me, right? Like, because the founders getting this all, like, at this vision, I'm going to exit. They don't realize that this doesn't change everyone else's world, right? Everyone else continues to live their lives, right? It's life-changing for you. It's not life-changing for everyone.
I love the concept of creating something and like you mentioned, kind of with the licensing. I'm curious, I'm sure all the circumstances are different in that packaging. Were they expecting, okay, they would pay the company for the license and then they'd be able to license it to others? Or they go, I want to maintain a license to non-competitive industries. How do they work it out so like the main company is not threatened by it, but
the buyer?
Yeah, the buyer. Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, some of this is the like, nature of what
this is such a cool technology. Like, I guess it's as soon as someone says, well, we're going to use that for this, the other thing, like, well, maybe we should be using it for this other, right? You're planning the idea, but I'm curious, how does it get executed a little bit in that circumstance, or what's the expectation of the seller and buyer?
Well, it all kind of depends, but I think there's two flavors of this. One is we've thought about this years in advance. So like we're 5 years away from an exit. We see this opportunity, and we actually, upfront set up the other entity, transfer the assets over there, right? Like it's not part of the business, and that's licensed back to this other company, and like so it's structurally it's just not part of the company to begin with. Now, when you go to sell it, any smart buyer is going to look at, well, what are you licensing and who owns those licenses? So what are they going to do with it? And a smart buyer might make sure that there are some restrictive covenants, around what the other company that's licensing can do it, or they may just reduce the valuation. They may just say, okay, well, you only have a license to this, and it's a core part of the business. So, there's a risk here. So we're not going to pay you $50 million, we're going to pay you $30 million because we're going to have to either rebuild it or we're going to have to offset that risk, somehow. So there's kind of option A, which is you do it upfront, you do it well in advance, and it's more of structurally you've already pulled it out. Plan B is okay. It's in part of the company, and as part of the deal, as a term of the sale, is you're asking for rights to be able to use it in some kind of non-competitive way, or in some way, and everyone has to define what competitive or non-competitive for what period of time, right? Or maybe you royalty it back, right? Say, look, I want to go off and do this. I mean, I've seen one or two cases where founders have done that, and then they sell that company back to the parent company, right? So it's like, hey, buy my main company, and I see an opportunity to kind of use this in a new way. Let me go out, spend a couple of years building that, and then I'll sell you that business too, right? So I think the trick here is, what is it you want to do? Like, where do you want to create value? What are the resources and assets that you would need to use that value? And how could you structure it in a way such that you could economically and sort of business logistics reasonably peel that off and continue to use that in some way? Yeah. And you get into funny ones where you get like personal identity and content and where a business, someone's reputation, like individual reputation, is really tied to the business, and what can they do and what can they not do. And yeah, I mean, you've heard of these kind of crazy horror stories of like individuals that kind of lose their ability to in their personal identity in a marketplace because that is branded and it's now part of this new company. So it gets a little dicey when you're dealing with some of the not intangibles and branded stuff. But
are there any
really
other do next things? Like, that's one example. Like, say, kind of thinking 5 years from now, 5 years from now, peeling something off, license, that someone can do separately. Any other interesting stories on how people start to think around? Because I know you work closely with people on this.
Yeah, I mean, typically there's the financial exit and then there's a strategic exit. On the financial exits, you're right. It's pretty much math, right? Like, you're basically saying, hey, here's the business. If we can capitalize it differently, we can put some debt in it. We can, add some more capital. We can grow it in these areas. There's clear opportunities for growth. And there's usually some kind of time frame, like 3 to 5, maybe 7 years on the outside, that you're going to sell again. And private equity, usually is playing these games. It's where I'm just going to juice the current business, make a bunch of money, flip it, and sell it to somebody else, and turn things around. There, in those cases, it's a pretty. I suggest to founders that that's a pretty surgical. Just like, okay, once you do the deal, if you want to stay on, great. It's a different game, but you're really done as an entrepreneur once you sell. The strategics are where this stuff becomes a little bit more interesting, where the underlying assets and capabilities. And I was involved in one situation where we didn't even know why the buyer was going to buy this company till after we did the sale. And then it sort of came out and we understood, like why they wanted some of these assets and stuff like that. So you never really know. But I think the more that you can try to figure out, not so much what is the value to you, but what is the value to that other business, to the buyer. And that's how you need to kind of structure the deal and structure the conversations and structure the valuation and kind of the deal structure, right? Because it depends on what they're going to do with it. It might be your clients, right? Like, they've got some product, maybe you're making $50 million a year selling to, these 50 important clients. Well, if they've got some other product, they can make $200 million a year selling to it. I mean, they just want your clients. And oftentimes they'll come in, buy the company, they get rid of all your people, right? Because we just want the client list. Maybe we want some underlying technology. Maybe we want, maybe it's access to a market, maybe it's access to a geography, maybe it's a certification, or, some kind of license that you have, or ability to operate in a certain place, geographic expansion. So the more you can kind of figure those things out, the more you can kind of understand where the potential deals are. And where are some of these opportunities of, like, maybe we don't just sell, maybe we just license, right? Maybe we do a joint venture, right, on this thing to get them into the market. Maybe we really don't need the whole company. Or, you realize that they're really just buying it for the client. So, all right, fine, keep the tech, right? Or keep a license to the tech, if that's really not why they're buying things.
No, I love that question, is what's the value to the other business? Mm-hmm. And there was one example I love to talk about, which is an internet security company. Can you tell people a little bit about that scenario?
Yeah, that was a fun one. I mean, so this was I had sold my business and I did a couple of interim COO and CEO roles, and then kind of got more formally into coaching a couple years after I sold. And one of the first companies that I started working with as a coach at the time was probably 50 people. Yeah, there was 50, 60 people. And I started running strategy sessions. We started doing planning. We started, going through the scaling up, 3Hag. Like I had a couple of different tools at the time. And, I grew with them. They grew with me. We started doing, I remember they did their Series B, Series C, and then ultimately a couple of years ago, they did a Series D at 140 million and, 600 people, right? They're on the path to go public, major backers. And it was just fun to kind of parallel my own growth as a coach and their growth as a company as I kind of started with my, kind of $5 to $10 million companies and started working with the 20 to 30 million and the 50 to 60 and 100, 200 million. Like as on one hand, as my coaching practice evolved and I saw kind of the different needs and the challenges and what I need to do as a coach. And then also like what didn't change, right? I mean, these companies have the same problems regardless of the size, right? Like you've got leadership issues, you've got management issues, you've got, how do you set up dashboards? How do you create metrics? How do you focus? How do you set priorities, right? Like every company struggles without the size. So it's just been funny to see what stayed the same and what's changed. And I'm sure I could have predicted earlier in the process what those things would be over time.
What are some of the things that didn't change? You mentioned a few like leadership issues. What else
I
you
would
felt
say,
really growth?
communication, alignment, right? Like just getting clear on who's doing what, right? Accountability, right? All those things. Like it just keeps becoming an issue. I think it goes back to the, growing a company is not purely additive. It's not just about like I need to add and add and add. I need to kind of add more skills. I need to add more capabilities. It's as much as it's additive, it's actually reductive too. Like I need to undo a lot of strategies, techniques, processes, styles, things that I do as leaders, right? I talk a lot about unteaching leaders things as much as I'm trying to teach leaders and getting them to realize that, that's the Goldsmith book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, right? Like the things that actually were incredibly successful for them up to a certain point now become like obstacles and get in the way of getting into the next level. So I think the interpersonal, the leadership style things, I think actually in some respects the bigger the company is, the simpler the strategy needs to be, because you've got to communicate it out to more and more people. And I think in the beginning when I was doing 10, 20, $30 million company strategy work, we could be pretty sophisticated. We could have these really kind of interesting angles. And, because we're only trying to align like 100 people, 150 people, you can communicate those out things pretty well. But as you get up to 500 people, 1,000 people, like your strategy's got to be super simple. It's like, here are the 3 things we do to win, right? Here's who we focus on, right? Here are the core processes, right? Like the more we keep that really simple, it's got to be good, but it's got to be simple and clearly communicate it. I think that's been probably the biggest challenge I've run into with the bigger companies.
What have you seen with mistakes with communication that people are making?
My favorite line is that the challenge with the communication is the illusion that it's occurred. And I think a lot of, particularly, I just find this with CEOs a lot and founder CEOs, is like I told them to do this. I'm like, okay, well, how and how many times and were they listening and what was the context, right? And what else was going on? What else did you tell them at the same time, right? It's like, oh, well, yeah, we mentioned it in this meeting with 6 other things and 3 other people were talking to them. And I also was telling them how upset I was about this other issue. Like, oh, okay, you've got to communicate it. I generally say, you tell them 6 times clearly in a way that they've responded accurately, and now we can talk about what their challenge is. But until then, we got to talk about what are you going to do differently to communicate better.
Thank you. I appreciate that. There was another person, we're talking about, people raising 140 million. One person just said their outcome, which is success, was I'm happy to come to work again.
Yeah. No, I love this. It was pretty recently. Yeah, it was in a nice business, $60, $70 million business. and founder CEO, and she came to me not out of desperation, but a little bit of like, I don't know exactly what to do next because I'm really frustrated. She had to kind of clean house on her team, and it was like, I get it, right? Like these challenges come in waves, and it can get pretty disheartening. And it's hard even when you see, okay, this is the work that needs to get done. There's clearly a path here. Like we can see success. We know that to kind of go through that emotionally and to feel kind of beat up and bruised. Um, we spent a couple of months just kind of making some changes, getting some better people in, restructuring things a little bit, cleaning up a bit. And within a couple of weeks, she came to me and she's like, I actually like coming to work now. And, for me, like that's the win, right? Like,
was it the just revamping the team, or what do you think? What were some of the things that, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't one thing.
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit of framing, it's a little bit of just like, this is entrepreneurship and this is being a CEO, right? And there's nothing surprising here. And yes, it's hard. And yes, these are difficult decisions and difficult conversations and difficult things to go through. And I think it comes down to kind of reframing it and then plotting a path, right? Like once you kind of see, it's like, okay, like I know I want to get to the top of this mountain, but if I don't have any idea of how I'm going to get there, like it just feels impossible. Versus if I kind of see like, oh, I see, we're going to go up the west side and we're going to do this ridge and then we're going to hook around and then we're going to come up the backside to the summit. And like, oh, okay, yeah, that's still hard, right? Like there's some super challenging, but at least I have a path. Like at least I see a way. And so a lot of what I end up doing is just plotting paths, right? Like how do we get to that goal? How do we define that goal? Figure out which summit you're trying to climb, and then at least have a sense of, okay, I think we can do it this way. Here's our first base camp. Let's get there, and then we'll kind of sort things out. Like progress, being able to make progress just starts creating some motivation. It's like, okay, I can do this. Like this is not, it's kind of, there's a psychological term of learned helplessness, right? The whole study with dogs and being shocked and all sorts of things that would be inhumane today. But like if you don't feel like there's hope, like you won't respond, right? You will just sit there. So
Yeah, it's a lot of work, I guess, to not only define these things, but then put the plan into action.
mhm.
I'd love to hear just briefly about your previous company. Whenever I watch other videos, or like this guy worked with some of like the pioneers of agile. So talk about your previous company and some of the things that helped you grow. Because I mean, going multiple times on in the ink list, you have to I don't know, double every year or something
Yeah.
like that. So talk about your early company.
Yeah. So I'll even go before that. I mean, as you mentioned, I was an architect originally, right? So I was, like building architect, like glass and bricks and mortar things, not computer architect. But I got into interactive media. I was doing a lot of computer modeling and stuff. Got into interactive media in the New York area, and had was part of a big roll up. So we were a 50-person company, got bought by a European agency. We immediately became 1,800 people, and I was running around Europe on projects. It was a lot of fun, and had the opportunity to work with a gentleman named Ivar Jakobsen, who is what they in the development world in the 80s, something called object-oriented programming, and there's something called the Three Amigos. He was one of the three people who really pioneered a really different way of thinking about software development or software or programming software, architecting software. And he's turned me on to something called, originally it was called extreme programming. I had a chance to work with them, and kind of got me hooked on the whole, like, how do we actually develop software products? And so I got deep into extreme programming, and iterative agile was the early kind of versions of lean agile software development. And so we started the software development company really as a way to do some projects. We had opportunity to work with some companies on developing software systems. And I was very intrigued with this idea of highly iterative, customer feedback driven software development, which, in the beginning, at the time, people extreme programming, like we were jumping out of planes with laptops or something, right? It was poorly labeled, but it was a really different way of thinking about the process, and not only about software, about the whole kind of product development and business development that's fueled all the lean startups and everything like that. And so So we kind of got into it accidentally, all right? And we had a project that led to another project, led to another project, and pretty soon I realized, okay, we got a company, we started hiring people, and that led to a new project, right? So it was kind of a snowball thing. And actually, one of the things I actually give us credit for is actually not growing as fast as we could have, and being reasonably disciplined about, like, I don't think I ever worked a weekend in my company, which is a little unheard of, I think, for, growth companies like that. And it was just because we had some principles around, let's stay really focused. When we're at work, we're going to be really focused. When we're not at work, go recover, spend time with the family, do other things. And I think that served us well. And we had some pretty big setbacks. We lost big clients. We had to kind of rebuild things. But it was being clear on like where we were generating value and how could we continue to stay focused on that. The other thing too, and one of the reasons I sold it is, we were early, right? And we could see, the rates that we were charging were kind of going down. The cost of our developers were going up. I saw these lines converging at some point. And so you realize as an earlier stage company, like things mature and there's probably either we're going to have to really grow or, I decided to tap out in the sense of like, I didn't want to do that big roll up. I didn't want to be a 5,000 person company and was happy turning over the reins to focus on other things that I wanted to do, and that was a personal choice. Right? And a lot of the challenges in these decisions are like, okay, what really is important and deciding what paths you want to go down on those things.
Bruce, I have one last question. Yeah. I know we have a couple minutes. I do want to point people to your website. If you checked out the video, it's eckfeldt.com, eckfeldt.com. He does have a assessment that he can share with you. And I always learn a lot by listening to you. Even before this call is a good excuse for me to do like 5 hours of just listening to your lessons. I'd love to hear some of your favorite books, resources over the years. I know Scaling Up is one of them. Any others that people should definitely check out?
Yeah. So, and to nod to Vern, I'll mention Vern here and Scaling Up. It was certainly influential in my business, and obviously it's been a core part of my coaching. Shannon Susko, who wrote 3HAG, Metronomics. I'm also certified in that framework. They both have amazing tool sets and have done amazing work and hugely helpful for businesses. So I always recommend those. For me personally, I think The Goal, Eli Goldratt, and I pretty much give that to all of my give that to all of my CEOs. Right, it's just kind of like core reading, just the philosophy of systems, sort of systems thinking and bottlenecks and root cause analysis. To Sell is Human, Dan Pink is another one that I give to a lot of my CEOs because I think that the whole selling, selling is huge for growth companies, and if you don't have a good mindset around selling, that can be a challenge. Goldsmith, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, is a good one just in terms of understanding leadership and growth and unlearning, right? Like I do a lot, like really focus on like, how do we get rid of strategies that are actually going to hold you back? I'm looking at what other ones I have right here. Those are the main, Blue Ocean Strategy. I think that's kind of a core one and really understanding differentiation and how do you create differentiation in the market. And I use that a lot with the businesses that I work with. What else is there? Those are the main ones. Annie Duke, Thinking in Bets. It's another one I reference a lot. Business is poker, not chess. So
love it. Bruce, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Everyone check out eckfeldt.com to learn more, and we'll see everyone next time. Bruce, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks for listening to the Rising Entrepreneurs Podcast. This episode is powered by Rise 25. Please subscribe and check out future episodes.